Hey everybody, this is David Collins from Ann Arbor Guitars. Today we're going to focus on intonation. Of course, there's countless resources and videos already out there on this topic, so we're not going to show you another how-to video. Instead, we're going to offer a few peeks into what really makes intonation an issue on guitars. The more you understand of what may be contributing to a problem, the better equipped you can be to reliably deal with it. So let's jump right in. We're going to use this monochord device for demonstration of some basic concepts. Right now we have it set up with a 17 thousandths plain steel string tuned to an E4 with a precise 20-inch scale length, so similar tension to a medium acoustic B string. Right now it reads right about 0 cents up to +2 at the attack. So we'll just use that as our reference. Now let's go ahead and push the string down at the 12th fret. We're going to use this pressure gauge with a little leather pad on the end to keep the pressure consistent, rule out the human interference. It's about 1 pound to get it to touch the strings. It's fairly stiff action, about 100 thousandths of an inch right here. We're going to add another pound roughly, bring it up to 2 to give a fair simulation of an average player's pressure. Now let's strike this again, and there we are, right about 11 or 12, 10 to 12 cents sharp. So why is it sharpening there? Obviously, when we push the string down to the frets, we're stretching the string out, and that's what sharpens it. That's why we need to add a little bit of compensation to flatten it back out when we fret. But let's try another approach with this. Now, instead of pressing the string down, we've actually built this monochord very precisely, perfectly level string height above the board all the way along. We're going to actually remove this fretboard and instead move our stop at the end to shorten it. With this, we can actually do this with zero deflection of the string at all. We've actually set it out leveled to where it does not push, pull, bend, twist, or affect the string tension in any way. So now, with it set at precisely 10 inches short, we're going to drop the stop, clamp the string down without stretching or deflecting it at all, and see where we end up. And as you can see, we're still about 5 cents sharp, even though we're not bending the string at all. So what exactly is going on here? What you're witnessing here is a result of the stiffness in the string. Now the stiffness is a property across its thickness as it bends, which is different from elasticity, which is a property along its length as it's stretched, which is what we usually refer to in regards to intonation issues. The stiffness, though, can actually introduce a number of complications. One is that strings don't bend at a perfect, finite point. This is easier to explain on a slightly larger model. If the string were perfectly flexible, it would bend exactly at the nut, fret, or saddle, something like this, hinging back and forth right at the boundary point. Real strings don't work that way, though. When they're firmly anchored at a boundary point, they don't actually flex perfectly all the way to the end. The string's stiffness creates a bit of a gray area, and the wave actually sees the boundary point shortened a bit from this end, somewhere in this range. So if we look at the actual vibrating lengths of the string, we may actually be shortening a 19.9 inch string down to around 9.9 as far as the wave sees it, rather than 20 down to 10 here. The stiffness also adds another quirk, which is that it introduces a tiny bit of bar-like properties to the string. What this means is that in addition to tension wanting to pull the string back to neutral, there's also a tiny bit of influence from its stiffness wanting to flex it back to straight, more like a xylophone bar than a string. Here's where things start to get a whole lot more complicated, and where we start to look not only at the fundamental of a note, but its overtones. When the A string on your guitar is vibrating at a fundamental of 110 Hertz, there are actually a whole lot more vibrations on the string at the same time. It's also vibrating in octaves, fifths. There are a number of different waves. Let's imagine that your fundamental, your A110, looks something like this on the string. It doesn't actually, but for simple pragmatic purposes, we're going to say it does. Let's look at what the A440 that's also vibrating is going to look like there. And it's going to move, please excuse my terrible drawing, but it's going to move in a pattern more like this. Now something you can see right away is that the A440 bends in a lot more places. This in turn means they're more prone to being accelerated and sharpened a bit more. What this can actually lead to is overtones being slightly sharper than they should be, essentially out of tune with the fundamental. This phenomenon is very well understood by piano tuners and is at the root of what's known as stretch tuning. Let's say a piano tuner has set their temperament in the middle octave of a piano, and now they're working on 2 octaves up and tuning the C 2 octaves above middle. They could set it to a perfect ideal C, but when played against the middle C, it wouldn't sound quite right, because although it's a perfect 2 octaves above, the double octave overtone on that middle C is actually a little bit sharper than it should be. So they have to stretch the tuning a little bit and tune the fundamental of the upper C to better match the upper harmonic of the middle C. Likewise, when they're tuning down into the lower octaves, they'll have to tune the fundamentals slightly flat, so the accelerated upper partials of the lower notes don't clash with the fundamentals of the octaves above. Now, this stretch tuning can vary quite a bit depending on the judgment of the individual piano tuner and which octaves or intervals they deem most critical to match. Let's look at some examples. Let's say this is our bass line 0 cents. For a grand piano, a stretch tuning may start out a little bit flat on the bass side, come to a nice decent plateau in the middle, and then sharpen again up on the treble, something like that. Of course, this line would be much more jagged, not really a smooth curve. If you were to look at the average stretch curve for an upright or spinet piano with much shorter strings, the curve would be much more drastic. You would be much flatter on the bass and have to extend much sharper up on the trebles. This is because with the shorter strings, often thicker to compensate for the lost length, the stiffness ends up playing an even larger role in accelerating the overtones. Coming back to guitars, this might give some insight as to the complications faced with players who use extreme drop tunings and thicker strings. The thicker the string, the lower the relative tension, the more stiffness can complicate issues with overtones and intonation. Just like tuning a spinet piano will demand significant compromises, tuning a Les Paul down to a drop C or B is going to bring some compromises as well. Moving beyond the strings themselves, let's look into some other issues. The biggest one, obviously, is temperament. Equal temperament is something that, for the most part, you really just have to live with on any modern chromatic instrument. If you haven't watched our video on temperament so far, I strongly suggest you do so. Simple summary for now, though, thirds and sixths especially are never going to sound as pure and naturally in tune as our ears naturally like, because guitars are largely built around equal temperament. One of the most common mistakes players make is try to tune to favor a particular chord, like an E major, where you end up with a major third interval between your D and G strings and then a minor third interval between your G and B strings. If you try to sweeten that, however, it gets even worse when you go to play an F minor and those roles are perfectly reversed. You end up with a minor third and a major third. One which wants to be about 14 cents flatter and the other about 16 cents sharper. So there's really no way to correct it. This brings us to another key point, though, and that's just being aware of how much influence the player can actually have on intonation during performance. Let's look at where the guitar as an instrument lies on the intonation spectrum. On one side, we have instruments like the piano. Here, intonation is rigidly predetermined by the tuner. Once set, the player has no real chance to influence it during performance. On the other side of the spectrum, we have the violin, which is fully flexible. Here, responsibility is left entirely on the performer for intonation while they're playing it. The guitar lies somewhere in between the two. Frets, of course, lay out a spectrum, a palette of notes to choose from, but the player still has a good deal of control over the final pitch. Of course, there's intentional bending of notes we're all familiar with, but there can be a lot more subtle ways intonation can be affected as well. A skilled player not only can sharpen notes, but also flatten intonation just a bit when needed, just by using subtle changes in finger placement or pressure. Take this D major chord played against an open D down here. Here we're trying to match this major third, which even if it's intonated perfectly, is trying to match a pure major third, which is quite a bit more flat, as you can hear. But listen closely. And I can bring that quite a bit flatter just by pressuring a little bit toward the bridge. It may sound a bit daunting, but just like your fingers can automatically assume a C or a G or a D chord shape, with practice you can actually train your muscle memory to slightly squeeze together that major third to sweeten it up a little bit when needed, or to stretch apart a minor third if you so desire. The player can also make a beautifully intonated guitar sound horrid if they're careless. For beginners, this control can be quite an annoying responsibility. More advanced players, however, may welcome this as a liberation, loosening the chains of equal temperament a bit. Regardless how you feel about it, though, it's a reality. Like it or not, the player's hands are one of the biggest single influences on intonation. It can't be overemphasized. Regardless of how well intonation is adjusted on a guitar, to a large degree, the player still holds the wheel. So let's shift into actually adjusting intonation and see how some of these principles come into play in application. Step 1, set your instrument up first. If you want your intonation to be at its best, you need to get all the other hurdles out of the way. The biggest elephant in the setup room by far is proper cutting of the nut slots. Aside from a few small elite builders, no guitar really comes from a factory with nut slots cut anywhere near what I would call acceptable. This applies to the big respectable names just as much as economy brands. A properly cut nut just demands tolerances tighter than factory production can generally achieve. Nut slots should be cut just barely above the fret plane, in the range of 1/1000th of an inch or so. It need be no higher than it would be if the nut were replaced with a fret which had been leveled properly right along with the rest of them. Unfortunately, it's not just manufacturers, but a lot of service techs who don't seem to do much better with this. It can be one of the most difficult aspects of a proper setup to really master, and finding a tech who knows how to do it right can be an elusive search in some areas. Of course, if the strings are even just a tiny bit too high at the nut, this can cause some terrible intonation headaches. The commonness of this problem seems to have inspired a number of products and systems which address the symptoms, often involving compensated nuts. So let's talk about compensated nuts for a minute. Now, the basic premise of compensated nuts is as such. Let's say we have a straight fretboard, and then we have our saddle down here, our nut right here, and a whole bunch of little frets spaced out along here. Now, the idea with compensated nuts is that when you push down at the first few frets, you're going to be bending at a relatively sharp angle because you're so close to the nut. And then it departs at a fairly shallow angle back up to the saddle. Compared to when you're fretting, say, up in the middle frets, this angle is not nearly so steep. And so you're coming down at a shallow angle there, and again departing at a shallow angle up to the saddle slot. So this is where you're bending the most, this is where you need the most compensation. Saddle compensation increases as you move toward the end of the board. If you compensate so that you're 10 cents flattening at the 12th fret, you're only going to be flattening 5 cents at the first fret. And because of all this bending, you actually need to focus more compensation down there. That's what nut compensation actually does. The problem with this idea is that if the nut slots are cut proper to begin with, then they should be right here at the same height as the frets as it leaves. Our string wide open should be leaving with a clearance from the fret plane just as it would from any other fret. It still gives it ample clearance over the following fret. So when we go ahead and fret this string at the first fret, we are no longer getting that sharp increase in angle. No more sharp here than we are when we fret up at the 10th or 12th. Actually, if the nut slot is cut proper, it does work out that the further up the neck, the more compensation you need. Now, this also applies to the string stiffness we talked about earlier. String stiffness only benefits from compensation at the saddle. Compensation at the nut does not account for any of the sharpening that comes from stiffness, only from elasticity or stretching of the string. So with the nut cut proper, just a hair above the fret plane, pretty much all the need for compensating the nut goes out the window, and a few decades of experience intonating guitar seems to bear this out pretty well. With nut slots cut proper, few players will experience any excess sharpening in the lower frets, or at least none that isn't suitably addressed by compensation at the saddle. Notice I did say few players though. This means there are some, but these are usually unique cases that deviate from typical setups. One example might be a guitar someone wants to use for a lot of slide use. Sometimes these setups need the nut slots a bit higher than normal, so they're not knocking into frets too bad with slide work close to the nut. With the higher nut slots, a bit of nut compensation can sometimes be in order. Likewise, some players who prefer extra light strings or drop tunings, as you go lighter and looser, or both, the ratio of stretch versus stiffness effects can change quite a bit, and sometimes that can favor a little bit of nut compensation. Like any treatment for your ails, though, it's important to look into the side effects for possible complications. The biggest side effect of nut compensation is that it will inevitably sharpen your notes on the upper frets. With most guitars, this isn't that much of a problem. Assuming you still adjust the saddles so your 12th fret region is intonated the same as it would be otherwise, once you play above the 12th with a compensated nut, your upper frets will get progressively sharper. How much? Not enough to really even notice in most cases if you compensate just a little bit, say like in the 10 to 15 thousandths range, like PRS and Taylor guitars come from the factory at. There you won't be off more than a cent difference pretty much anywhere on the board. Move up to 30 thousandths at the nut, like where the Featon system puts electric guitars, and you'll end up about 2 cents flatter at the first fret, but you'll shift to about 2 to 3 cents sharper at the uppermost frets. Get into stuff like the Nirvana system, where you might have a G string compensated 85 thousandths or more, and you can be more than 5 cents flattened down here at the first fret and pushing near 10 cents sharp at the end of a 22 fret board. Of course, your nut slots would have to be grossly high to justify this kind of compensation, certainly farther than I would ever personally go. If you watched our video on scale lengths, though, you'll remember something peculiar about Gibson electrics and older Martin guitars. Their frets were spaced differently to the old rule of 18. This is where Gibson's unique fret spacing comes into play, with potential to impact how you may choose to intonate and compensate your guitar. Compared to a modern standard fret spacing as a reference with no nut compensation, here's how a Les Paul would intonate. Tiny bit of flattening in the middle frets, combined with a little bit of sharpening as you progress toward the end. This is what you naturally get with rule of 18 fret spacing. Most folks would never notice a difference. After all, it's not like many people hang on to long, complex, sustained chords in the 17 to 22 fret range. When you're there, people are usually in and out quick, fast runs, bends and vibrato, all sorts of things that don't give much of a chance for a few cent difference to be heard. Let's say someone wanted to compensate the nut on their Les Paul, though. Here's where we enter the realm of compounding side effects. Add rule of 18 frets plus compensated nut, and you end up with sharpening on top of sharpening. If you add 30 thousandths compensation to the nut, like in the Featon system, now we're moving up to around 12 cents sharp by the very end of the board. Add in the prescribed tuning and intonation offsets, and all of a sudden you're up to 15 cents sharper than normal. Or if you wanted to go all the way and put an Nirvana nut on your SG, you'd end up about 18 cents sharper at the last fret compared to where you would be on a standard scale. So compensated nut systems could actually deliver a noticeable difference between installing one on a Gibson Les Paul versus an Epiphone Les Paul. Another unintended side effect of compensated nuts is, of course, sharpened intonation when you use a capo. If you set up a guitar and intonate it with a compensated nut and then install a capo on there, then all of your frets above your open string, or in this case the open capoed string, will be sharper than they would be if the nut weren't compensated. Now, it's not that big of a deal if we're only talking 10 or 20 thousandths compensation, but it's still something to be aware of. So what big magic tricks do I have in my pocket to make intonation work great? Well, honestly, I've spent the last few decades working on this issue with too much time studying theory and even more doing real work with it in the field. For years, I was determined to come up with a better system of fret spacing or some improved mix of compensation and tuning offsets, trying everything that others had come up with and a good many novel tricks of my own. In the end, though, what I've finally come up to see as the best solution is just what's been under everyone's nose all along. I find the ideal system to be standard 12 through to 2 fret spacing, standard nut placement, and careful compensation at the saddles. Beyond that, it all comes down to good setup and good playing. So, finish up with a summary of practical tips in the last few minutes. First of all, obvious things: test your intonation when the guitar is in playing position, not laying on its back where the neck can get pushed around. If fretted notes are flat up here, bring the saddle point forward. If they're sharp, move it back. Everyone knows that. Another common thing I tell people is the 12th fret is, although it's a very standard reference for adjusting intonation and prescribing offsets if you wish, there's really nothing sacred about it. Personally, I often would prefer to noodle around, form chord shapes all around the neck, and observe intonation errors all the way through. Consider the middle range, the upper range, and the extreme upper range in my adjustments, not just isolated to the 12th. Also, make observations based on actual playing styles. If you're setting up for a light touch player who's going into the studio, then you set your intonation with a similar touch. If you're adjusting for a heavy-handed blues player who just plays really high energy shows on stage, adjust with a heavy grip in mind. Of course, watch out for bad strings, whether they're old and worn or faulty right out of the box. If you notice intonation problems that weren't there before, check and change your strings, and of course, always set intonation with fresh strings. On electric guitars, one of the common problems can actually be the pickups themselves, especially on single coils. Common enough that it's often referred to as stratitis, when the pickups, specifically the neck pickup usually, is too close to the strings. Humbuckers don't have this problem as often because you have a north pole right adjacent to a south pole magnet, and so the field kind of confines itself. They attract each other. On a Strat, we have a very tall magnet with the north and south separated by quite a bit, so that upper pole really has quite a long stretch and can really pull a good deal of force on the string. Can cause all sorts of odd pulsing, beating, and flattening of the intonation. So if you notice problems on an electric guitar similar to that, first step is drop your pickups, especially the neck, sometimes the middle pickup, and see if it goes away. Now with acoustic guitars, there are all sorts of other things that can happen. You can have a very mobile top that happens to resonate very strongly near a particular note, and strangely enough, if it resonates close enough, it can actually pull notes near it slightly sharp or slightly flat. This guitar actually makes a wonderful example of that right around its A, which can be quite a pain for tuning. If I play the open A, you can see I'm running easily in the 7 to 10 cents flat range, but when I obscure some of the sound hole and change the pitch frequency, all of a sudden I'm right on pitch. Flattening drastically when I open it up, which you can hear. There's actually a resonance very close to that A right there in the chamber frequency. Sometimes these problems can be helped by changing the mass of the top with things like different bridge pins, bone or brass or lighter plastics or wood, to change the fundamental frequency of the soundboard. Sometimes it can't really be changed easily without drastic revoicing or reporting of the box. Other cases, such as this, being a personal guitar, I just adapt to it and find slight offsets that work with the tuning that actually make it work quite well in practice. But it is something worth being aware of so that you can at least make slight accommodations to it when you're setting intonation and not end up chasing something that can't be caught at the saddle and ruining the intonation across the entire board just to chase one unique anomaly that happens to occur around one or two notes. With experience and attentiveness, you can also actually put your electronic tuner away and use your ears similar to how a piano tuner would. By using various octaves across various stretches and strings, various open against fretted or harmonics against fretted. You can actually count beats, and using your ears see the same discrepancies that a strobe tuner reveals by use of its pulsing light and spinning wheel. Not only can trained ears match the accuracy of the best strobe tuner, but with experience can actually exceed its results by being able to factor in the natural inharmonic overtones into your adjustments, similar to stretch tuning on a piano. This is a discipline that takes a lot of practice and training, but it can be useful. There are also cases where intentional offsets can be useful, both in intonation and in open tuning. I do find most of the generic sweetened systems that are available to be of limited benefit, though, at best, as to serve their actual purpose really means they have to be tailored and tweaked toward each individual guitar to accommodate individual nuances. Just like a smooth, average stretch tuning chart for a piano, canned formulas just don't tend to work that well in my experience. And finally, remember that in the end, the biggest part can be up to the players themselves. Ultimately, intonation adjustments serve to deliver the best neutral palette for players to work with, getting rid of gross errors and letting them not worry about intonation most of the time, but leaving some flexibility to move it around when it suits them when they want to shift and sweeten chords. I believe it was Hubert Sumlin quoted as saying, "I never tune my guitar, I just play it in tune." There's some wisdom in there, a player who not only knew how much of the intonation was actually in his own hands as a player, but learned how to control it very well, all the while never losing sight of the music. Thank you so much for watching. Please remember to subscribe to us here on YouTube. You can find us at Ann Arbor Guitars on Facebook or check out our website at annarborguitars.com. We'll be back with more videos. Thanks again, and we'll see you soon.